you're very welcome back. And as promised at the beginning of the show this evening, I have Siobhan McGowan on the line with me, journalist and musician who lived and worked in London for much of her life before returning to Ireland several years ago. She's from a family of great storytellers, the most prominent of which is her brother Shane McGowan of the Pogues that you just heard there with Dirty Old Town. Her first book, The Trial of Lota Ray, has earned rave reviews, and now she's just published her second one, The Graces. And as I say, I'm delighted to have her on the phone line tonight. Siobhan, you're very welcome. Many thanks for taking time out to talk to me tonight, and I'm sure your schedule is pretty busy.
Oh, thanks, Jean. No, it's great. It's lovely to talk to you. Actually, I was in Dublin and we're on the road home to Tipperary, and I was hoping that the rain was going to stop beating off the roof and the windows here so that you'd be able to hear me. But luckily, it has calmed down, thank God.
Fantastic. The wonderful joys of internet and mobile phones, etc., etc.
I know.
So you've just published your second book, The Graces, Siobhan. Was it something you always wanted to do, to become an author?
Yeah, I mean, right from the very start, and I mean right from a little girl, really. I always had a vision of myself. I had a vision of myself putting a book on a shelf when I was very, very young, and it had my name on it. And I just always wanted to do it. So I did write. So I did journalism, and I wrote stories, and I wrote little plays, and I wrote poems, and I wrote songs. And I always did want to write a novel. But it took me a long, long time to get the discipline to actually, the actual discipline of sitting down and starting and finishing a novel takes, as you probably know, I mean, God, it takes more than a year. You have to actually really want to do this thing to finish it. So it took me into my late 30s, actually, until I knew I was able to do that. And once I got that discipline, thankfully, I never lost it. I'm very disciplined now.
And you've had quite a colourful career up until you became the author. Of course, as we've mentioned, you're a sister to Shane, and you worked with the Pogues, publishing their fanzine. Fanzine, and that's a new word. When I was sort of looking up, and I said, "What is a fanzine?" It's a magazine for fans.
Yeah,
I found that out.
Yeah.
So you dabbled at writing with that, and then you were PA to Van Morrison for a number of years as well.
Yeah, well, the Pogues thing, I was with the Pogues, so I was doing freelance journalism, and then I started to work in the Pogues office in London, Camden Town, and so I went and I did their fanzine, their magazine, fan club magazine for them, and travelled with them and was, working with them. And then I actually came to Dublin in about 1988, and I formed my own band called The Frantic, which we were Frantic, but we played around quite a lot of the old institutions like Baggot Street and the Olympia and all that kind of stuff. But I was writing my own songs then. But the thing is that I actually never really felt comfortable with the performance side of it. I liked writing the songs, but I was never comfortable with the kind of music business side of things. It wasn't really me, But having said that, my sister-in-law introduced me to Van Morrison. We met at the Shelburne Hotel, and he just said to me, "Would you like to go to America?" And of course, I was in my late 20s, I said yes, And so he took me on as his personal assistant, and I worked with him for 2 years. And we travelled all across America and Europe. And, I mean, it was fantastic. We went I had never been to Los Angeles. I'd never been to San Francisco. He took me to those places, and I met people there like John Lee Hooker and Junior Wells and Jimmy Witherspoon, all the great blues legends, which were heroes of mine, and ended up in their kitchen singing with them. And it was just like a dream, really.
That must have been a wonderful experience for you, indeed. Just even talking meeting your idols like John Lee Hooker, etc., etc. So, you were a singer, you were a songwriter, you were a publisher, and so obviously, and then Shane, your brother, writing songs as well. So you must have come from a very creative background, a creative home, Siobhan.
Yeah. Well, look, Mum and Dad both myself and Shane say they're extraordinary people. I mean, my mother came from Tipperary, from a country background. My dad was from Dublin. but they were way ahead of their time. You know, they were very liberal thinkers, very broad-minded, very creative. They raised us to really believe in ourselves and to speak for ourselves and to not necessarily believe everything we're told. You know, the opposite of going to school and listening to what the teacher says. We were told to challenge what we heard, to think about things for ourselves. And a creative side, I remember they even let me, I mean, actually, the truth is myself and Shane wrote and drew from a very early age. That was our number one thing that we loved doing, writing and drawing, both of us. And Mum and I was wilder than Shane on that because I used to draw all over my bedroom walls, and Mum and Dad used to let me. But I mean, you know, it was just a plain wall and they let me do it. And when we used to come, in those days, we'd get the ferry to Holyhead to cross to Dublin. When we used to come to Ireland, and myself and Shane would get a blanket and put it over us, and we'd be scribbling and writing and drawing there in the back, all in the dark under the blanket, doing our writing and drawing. So, yeah, it was very creative. Dad himself writes a lot of satirical poetry, and Mum was a really gifted singer and you know, magical kind of person.
Mm-hmm. So, as the old cliche says, the apple didn't fall far from the tree.
Yeah, I think that's true from both of them. I think they were both very, very unusual people.
Mm-hmm. And this is your second novel, and you were saying that it's sort of something that you always wanted to do. But to get a publisher, like, was there a lot of hard work getting your first novel published, Siobhan?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you see, I told you that it took me into my late 30s to get the discipline. It took me about 10 to 12 years to get published. I wrote a children's story first, and I got that published in my local paper, the Nina Guardian, and that turned into a novel. And then I wrote and rewrote that many times, like learning my craft. But that didn't get picked up. And then I wrote another adult novel, and that got me an agent in London, but she put it out on sub to publishers, and that didn't get picked up. And then what happened was my mother died suddenly, and it completely, you know, took the ground from under my feet. But the thing is that I found writing, you know, as cathartic, and it's always been my place of refuge. So I did write. I kept writing through it, but it didn't produce my best work. So my agent and I parted ways. But I then started to write The Trial of Lotta Ray, and that was the novel that got me my publisher, my agent that I have now, who is actually Irish, Sarah O'Keefe. She originally comes from Waterford, but she's worked 20 years and she's based in London. And she got me my first publishing deal. So it was a long road to publication.
Excellent. So now this is your second one, The Graces, and just give us a little synopsis of what the storyline of The Graces is, Siobhan.
Yeah. Okay, so it's about a young woman called Rosaline Moore who's born with the sight, so she's a seer, and she's said, like her grandmother, to be touched by the graces, so that's where the title comes from. But when she sees too much in her native Clare, she flees to Dublin, and she's quickly taken in by a group of spiritualists called mesmerists, and she becomes famed throughout Dublin, a famed mystic known as the Rose. Now, the actual book is narrated from her deathbed. She's dying, and she's speaking to a priest. She's confessing herself to a priest, and this is where and within that confession, she makes a last extraordinary prophecy, and that only sees her legend grow. But she also makes another deathbed revelation about a tragedy in the community, a heinous crime that the community's once loved but now imprisoned abbot has confessed. And she tells a different tale about that. She tells something else that might have actually happened, that the truth might not yet be known about it.
Mm-hmm. And from what I've read, some of the stories in the book that Rose sees, they've happened in real life, or there were incidents in your own life that were similar, Siobhan.
Yeah, well, definitely what happened in the book, Rosaline's grandmother is said to have the sight, and Rosaline inherits this. But my own great-grandmother, who was Margaret Lynch in Tipperary, was said to have the sight, and she actually foretold the death of her youngest son. And in the book, that I tell that faithfully. I only change the name. So my own great-grandmother woke up in terror in the night. She had dread gripping her stomach, and she went rushing down to her youngest son Tommy's bed and begged him to stay close to the house, that she couldn't see what it was, but something dreadful was going to happen to him. And of course, he was only 17, so he kind of laughed it off. And my family had a thrashing machine which was quite a big thing, and they went around to all neighbouring farms with it. And it wasn't long after that nobody saw what happened exactly, but he must have tripped out in front of the big thrashing, rotating wheel, and he got caught up in its blades, and unfortunately he was terribly maimed, and he died instantly. And my great granny went rushing out into the fields and just wailed into the night. And I tell all that in the book. But it's funny, isn't it? Like, I mean, that happened so many generations ago, but it's as vivid to me now because it's handed down, you know. And so you hear it when you're a child, and it stays with you. So I think that came out in the book. You know, so I think that definitely came out.
And there's another story that you recount as well, of The Face at the Window, which is another episode, a similar episode.
That's right. That was my mother. So that was during the Second World War, which of course didn't touch Ireland. It was the emergency, but we weren't involved, obviously. But Mum was brought up in the same house that Great Granny lived in. That house is still in our family. It's still there. So it's had generations of us there. And Mum was a young girl, maybe 14, 15. And there was a great family friend called Bill, who was American. And he used to come over and visit, you know, and the fact that he was even able to afford to do that in those days, so he was full of presence and style, and Mum just loved him. And the thing is, so during the war, of course, there was no visiting. So Mum one day was passing the small window, kitchen window, and she called out to Granny, and she said, "Mummy, come here, come out to the yard." So they went out to the yard, and Granny said, "Well, what are you looking for?" She said, "I know this will sound, you know, not right, but I saw Bill. You know, I saw Bill at the window, and he was smiling, big wide smile on him." And Granny said, "We can't." They knew that they couldn't because Bill was in America. Now the thing is that Bill was in the Air Force in America, and it was only a couple of weeks later that they got the news through the letter that Bill had died. He had been killed in battle, and at the time that my mother saw him, he would have already been dead. Now that really affected Mum. But I think what's really about that, and that's in the book as well, but I think what's really funny about that isn't it that he was smiling at her. It's almost like, if that does happen, if that's true and the dead come back, it's almost to comfort us, isn't it? You know, to say it's okay.
Yes.
You know, that, so he was smiling at her, and she always remembers that.
It's amazing indeed. Now, your first novel, The Trial of Lotta Ray, it was set in London in the 1900s, and this is set now in Ireland, in Dublin. Is it at the beginning of the century as well? Have you a love for historical fiction, Siobhan?
Yeah, I've always loved history, always loved it. It's like the biggest story ever told. Like, to me, I've always been fascinated about what happened, where and when to get us to where we are now. I'm fascinated by that chain of events. You know, I'm also fascinated by if something hadn't happened, where would we be now? And it can be so simple if you think about like your own life. Like, we're all living a kind of story at the moment. So your own life, if you take the wrong turn, something happens that's different than if you've taken another turn. I'm always fascinated by all that. I'm particularly interested in the turn of the 20th century history, probably because it's nearer my own time, and my own grandparents were living then. So I identify with it. I have known the people that came from that time and were young in that time. But because it was a time of great hope, in England and in Ireland, because of course Britain were the rulers of Ireland then, so a lot of what was happening there was happening here. So you had all the big liberal welfare reforms, you had votes for women, crying out for votes for women, you had scientific advances, and then the terrible big Black doom of the First World War came and robbed all the dreams of a generation, butchered a generation, basically, and took all their dreams and all their hope. But the interesting thing is it also changed the world and made it start to become what we have today, because everybody, again, for instance, not everybody knows that it wasn't just women that didn't have the vote, it was the common man that didn't have the vote either. It was actually only wealthy landed men that were allowed to vote. The common man was not allowed to vote. It was only after the First World War that he got the vote, and women got the vote, and then because they would not bow to authority in the same way anymore, because they had learned that they couldn't trust authority, because authority had taken them into this terrible, terrible war. So they didn't trust empire, they didn't trust king, and they didn't trust country. And so the whole world changed, basically.
And I believe that you're in the process of planning a third book, and again, it's set at the beginning of the 20th century as well.
Yeah, so it's this one's slightly later, so it's in Ireland, obviously, and it's in Ireland, and it's at the end of the Civil War, and it's in an island community off the west coast of Ireland, there has been atrocities, and a particular atrocity committed during the war on the mainland, and it's about players in that atrocity going back to the island, and the disturbances within the island community due to that, and what revenge or not might be taken, and what comes from that.
They're all really interesting topics. So the Graces is out now, and I've asked Declan to send me a copy of it, so I'm looking forward actually to reading it. And we have a Highland Radio Book Club here as well, Siobhan, so we might feature it some month now in the autumn when we get back to reading again. So it's available in all good bookshops, I presume, and online as well.
Yes, it's in everywhere you might get your books, all the bookshops basically, and online. So anywhere that you'd normally get your books, you should be able to get it there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking time out, and I hope that your journey ends safely for you. And good luck with the Graces, and good luck with your third novel as well. So many thanks indeed for taking time out tonight.
Thanks so much, Jean. It's been great talk to you.
And to you too. All the best.
It's the 50% off mega summer sale at Right Price Tiles and Wood Flooring. Up to 50